Welcome back to the Future of DeFi Fireside Chat series. The following is a conversation with Christopher Giancarlo. Chris is the former chairman of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, CFTC, and served at the CFTC under both the Obama and the Trump administration. He's widely known as the Crypto Dad, which is also the title of his new fascinating book.
In this conversation, Chris shares his vision and experience at CFTC, his new ideas on next-generation technology and big data-driven regulation, his digital dollar project exploring CBDC, his conviction, and his new book as Crypto Dad. Here is our conversation with Christopher Giancarlo. Hi, Chris. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here, Dawn. Great to be with you.
Thank you. So, Chris, you were the former CFTC chair under both Obama and Trump administration. It's amazing. So can you tell us a little bit more about your story and your path leading you there?
Sure. So I spent the first 15 years of my life as a practicing lawyer in New York and London. And I worked with a lot of emerging European technology companies that were doing business in the United States. And as a result of that, in 2000, I was asked by a client to help them build one of the first electronic trading platforms for a type of sophisticated financial product called a credit default swaps. And my firm, GFI Group, grew and grew and grew. And in 2005, we took the company public. And by 2008, we had become the world's largest marketplace for wholesale transactions in swaps. We were not a trader ourselves. We operated the marketplace where wholesale market participants bought and sold swaps products, and in our case, credit default swaps. And as you can imagine, we became the epicenter of what became the 2008 financial crisis. The credit condition of the world's largest financial institutions could be measured by the credit spread, basically the premium that it cost to insure against the default of their debt obligations, which is how the credit default swaps market works. And I recall distinctly in a few days before Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, getting calls from the New York Federal Reserve asking me what we were seeing in the markets. And it was clear to me that regulators had no better visibility into the credit quality of the world's largest financial institutions than to call institutions like mine and ask what the spread was on certain names like Lehman Brothers and JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. And so I became actually a supporter of some of the core reforms that went into the Dodd-Frank Act, reforms like central clearing of derivatives and greater transparency, regulatory transparency into the credit exposure and the derivatives exposure of financial institutions. But I had another realization. And at the time of Lehman's collapse, it was believed by the Federal Reserve and the regulatory community and the entire marketplace that the amount of outstanding gross exposure of Lehman Brothers against credit default swaps written on its potential failure was in the neighborhood of $400 billion. And if the amount of exposure on Lehman Brothers was $400 billion, then the estimates were that the amount of exposure on a Goldman or a Morgan Stanley might be 800 billion, and the exposure on a JP Morgan might be 1.2 trillion. And therefore, there was a fear that a domino effect would happen if these institutions fell. And therefore, the TARP program was born to shore up their balance sheets with basically federal provided capital. But we now know, thanks to work that was done under my administration at the CFTC, that the net exposure, not the gross exposure, the net exposure of a failure of Lehman Brothers would have been about 9 billion, not 400 billion, but 9 billion. If we knew back in 2008 that a failure of Lehman Brothers would trigger a net exposure of 9 billion, one of the options available to the Fed would have been to write a check. Another option would have been to let it fail, because it would not have been a domino effect on Wall Street. but we didn't have that information. And that's one of the reasons why I became a fan of greater regulatory transparency. But I also became a fan, and then over the next few years, of blockchain technology, because I thought if you could have a distributed ledger of all of those transactions, then we would know in real time not what the gross exposure was, but what the net exposure of financial obligations. And so I became a supporter of the reforms that eventually made their way into Title VII of the Dodd-Frank Act to reform the swaps market. And as a result, President Obama, when an opening on the commission opened up, asked me if I would join the commission in 2013. And I eventually took my place on the commission after my Senate confirmation in 2014. But I also became a big fan of distributed ledger technology. And in 2015, I gave a speech in New York in which I called for a do no harm regulatory response to distributed ledger technology, because I thought the technology, and I still believe very much, that the technology contains within it in a way to actually modernize and provide greater transparency to our existing financial market infrastructure. And that's how I arrived at the CFTC. I was sworn in for a 5-year term in June of 2014, and my term ended in the spring of 2019. I departed the agency in the summer of 2019. And as you mentioned, I went there to serve a 5-year term under President Obama. President Trump was elected in the fall, in November of 2016, and he named Gary Cohn of Goldman Sachs as his National Economic Council head. And Gary Cohn and I have known each other for a decade or more, and he called me up and said, "Do you enjoy your work at the CFTC?" I said, "I did." He said, "Would you like me to recommend you to the president-elect to be chairman?" I said I would, and the next thing I knew, I was sworn in as chairman, acting chairman on Inauguration Day 2017. And then to my great honor and a slight surprise, I was unanimously confirmed as the full chairman in the summer of 2017, which proves that Congress doesn't know what the CFTC does, and it probably proves that I didn't annoy too many of them, or not many of them, during my first 2.5 years at the commission. Anyway, I'm honored to have been unanimously confirmed for the job, not once, but twice.
And one of your first challenges at the CFTC was a product called Bitcoin futures. And it's great to also hear your conviction and your passion for blockchain distributed ledger technologies. And at the CFTC, you've led the agency to encourage financial innovation to prepare the US for what you call the Internet of Value. And subsequently, the cryptocurrency community dubbed you as Crypto Dad, which is also the title of your new book. So can you tell us how this name came about?
Sure. As you know, Dawn, in life, you sometimes take on a job to do one thing, and then life happens, and suddenly you find yourself focusing on something that you didn't go there to do. I went to the CFTC to focus on reforms to the over-the-counter swaps market, a wholesale market. I wound up earning a name and a reputation for cryptocurrency, and the story is somewhat unique. In the summer of 2017, the spring and the summer, the first big rally in Bitcoin took place, what some people call Bitcoin Rally 1.0. And we were approached. We began studying it quite early. We created something called Lab CFTC, and one of its first instructions was to get up to speed on crypto very rapidly. And so by the time we were approached in July of 2017 about launching Bitcoin futures on our large US exchanges, we were already getting up to speed on the product. But we faced a lot of opposition. We faced opposition from some online brokers, from some wholesale brokers, from some futures commercial merchants, and in fact, the trade association for the industry. There were full-page ads in the Wall Street Journal calling on us to hinder the rollout of Bitcoin futures. But ultimately, I felt it's not for regulators, unelected bureaucrats, to make decisions about about the trading of legal products in the marketplace. It's really for the marketplace to determine the value proposition of those instruments and not for unelected regulators. And so at the end of the day, we allowed the Bitcoin futures products to launch, and they launched and have become very successful and very, very well performing marketplaces. Nevertheless, not long after we gave the green light for the launch of Bitcoin futures in December of 2017, I received an official summons to appear before the Senate Banking Committee. And I fully expected to be raked over the coals in front of that committee for our decision to greenlight Bitcoin futures. So as you do when you're asked to appear before a Senate committee, you prepare a very lengthy document. We prepared a step-by-step explanation of all the decisions we had made to give the green light to Bitcoin futures. And still, as I was preparing for the hearing the night before, I was very conscious of how do I condense a 60-page summary into a 5-minute opening set of remarks. And I realized, you know what, I'm not going to be able to do this. So the next morning, as I'm sitting at the table in front of these senators on the dais, and the little light on my desk went from red to green, and I had 5 minutes to give my opening remarks, I said, Senators, if you'll allow me, I know I'm here as the head of a federal regulatory agency, but I'd like to talk to you wearing a different hat. I'd like to talk to you as a dad. And then I explained to them that I had 3 children in their 20s, and I had nieces and nephews, and we had just come back from our family ski trip that we do every year. I do that with my brothers and their children. And all our kids wanted to talk about every night was Bitcoin. Now, these are kids. They're not kids anymore. They're adults. But these when they were younger, my brothers and I had tried to interest them in the stock market. We had given them little brokerage accounts and tried to interest them in buying stocks. And you know what, Dawn? No interest whatsoever. And yet now they were fascinated by Bitcoin. And it struck me, and I was explaining this to the senators, that this newfound interest is something to be kindled. It's not something to be suppressed. And I said, Senators, I think we owe it to this new generation to treat their interest in Bitcoin with respect and not with derision. And just as I had said, I want to talk to you as a dad, my Twitter handle just exploded. I think I had 1,200 Twitter followers the morning I sat down for this hearing. By the weekend, I had almost 45,000 Twitter followers. And they had come up with different names for me. And one of them was Crypto Dad, because I had said I'm here as a dad. And so at first, I didn't know what to do with this sudden internet Twitter fame that I had. But I've decided it's actually a way of communicating. So I've embraced the Twitter, the Crypto Dad name. It's not one I chose for myself. It was one that was given to me, and I've embraced it. And a few months later, when Hester Peirce joined the SEC, and she started speaking out about the importance of respecting crypto, she became Crypto Mom. So we're the Crypto Mom and Dad, and we're good friends, by the way. We have a friendship that goes way back. And I write about our friendship in my book. But it's really nice to be Crypto Dad, and it's really great to have my friend Hester Peirce as Crypto Mom.
It is truly unique, and it's really amazing. And so just a quick follow-up then. So what do you think caused the difference between your children's reaction to stock versus Bitcoin? Like you couldn't get them interested in trading stock, but they were so interested in Bitcoin.
You know, I think we've made some mistakes in our approach to investor protection in the United States. You know, what investor protection has basically become a way of protecting non-wealthy people from investing in some of the best opportunities. You know, our accredited investor process basically keeps ordinary people and younger people, right? Because by definition, they don't have the wealth of their parents. It's blocked them from some of the most exciting investments. And so we actually have an investor protection program that allows wealthy and successful and older people to invest in some of the most exciting ventures and keeps young people out of the most exciting ventures. And crypto does the opposite. Crypto is an opportunity for young people to invest in some very exciting ventures. And so I think we've kind of missed the point in a lot of our investor protection measures in the United States. And I think that's part of the reason why young people are excited about crypto, because they can gain access. It's an open access world as opposed to a closed access world.
Wonderful. So as we see like this transition or the emergence now of a alternative DeFi financial system with DeFi, we still have the existence of the traditional finance system, right, which has been well tested. However, like the current financial system and infrastructure are rather ancient, as you also mentioned in your book, right? I mean, checking cashing in a check takes like a few days. This takes a big toll on our economy. So, what is in your mind what are the biggest challenges that the traditional financial system will face in the next maybe 10 to 20 years?
Well, I worry that that parts of the traditional system will be primarily motivated by protecting their system, protecting their rent collection fiefdoms, protecting their and using regulators to help them protect the existing function. You know, new innovations create a type of constructive destruction. You know, a type of creative destruction, and I worry. And an existing financial system has served very well. Let's be honest. It's a remarkable structure, but it has shortcomings. One of its shortcomings is it's exclusive. Why is it exclusive? Because it's based upon identity in every case for bank account-based transactions. And yet, in a world of 8 billion people, 1.5 billion do not have identity, which means they're by definition excluded from the existing infrastructure. So our existing system is exclusive. And it's old, and it's creaky, and it's slow, and it's expensive. This innovation presents the opportunity to modernize all that, not necessarily replace it, but modernize it, replace the weakest links and modernize the other links. But my worry is that the existing legacy system is so ingrained, and the regulators of it are to some degree captive of it. And I saw that myself being a regulator, the degree to which the legacy players are well connected to the regulators, and regulators themselves are concerned about too much change because they like regulatory convenience, and they've all found their home in the existing system. And I'm just worried that they'll try to fight it for too long. Now, eventually, they won't be able to fight it. Why? Because there's a young generation that totally gets it. And that generation is gradually going to move into regulators and gradually move into banks and move into the financial system. And they'll bring their understanding of this innovation with them, and eventually change will come. You cannot fight technological change. If you do, you just become a backwater and a closed system. And the United States, we've often embraced change. I do worry a little bit that we're going to resist this for too long, and then it'll be a rush to catch up. And look at some of our economic competitors, like China, for example, that is embracing this new innovation in many ways. In ways that are not attractive as a means of social control and social credit scoring, but in other ways that are worthy of emulation, because they see digital currency as an operating system for the world's first blockchain-based, digitally networked economy, which will reduce a lot of latency and a lot of cost. We can learn a lot from their doing. In fact, the official sector can learn a lot from what the private sector is doing with the emergence of stable coins and digital assets. So there's a lot to learn, and I just hope we're not too rigid in our response. We need to be more flexible in our response. The trick is to harness technology for good and restrict technology for bad. And if you get out in front, you have a fairly good chance of doing that. If you wait too long, then you're going to be stuck with what you've got. You've missed the opportunity, I think, to harness it. And that's what I tried to do during my time as CFTC chairman, was to say, this technology is coming. How do we prepare for it? How do we think ahead? How do we harness it for good? How do we make our markets healthy and dynamic, free of fraud and manipulation, but open to new innovation, open to new digital assets and digital commodities?
In what way do you believe can we harness DeFi and CeFi for good while they both coexist, right? So in what way do they complement each other or maybe compete?
Well, so DeFi is a total mind blower for regulators. It really messes with their head. And why is that? Because the traditional analog process of regulation is pretty much the same, whatever the ecosystem. It could be financial services, it could be healthcare, it can be taxi and medallion licensing. It's pretty much the same. That is, regulators look at the ecosystem and say, okay, where are the intermediaries? Where are the choke points? Where are the bottlenecks? We will license them. We will register them. We will then assign to them certain duties, such as collecting data, monitoring their members, adopting rules and processes and rules of the road. And then in return for the intermediaries doing these things, regulators give them certain mini monopolies and barriers to entry. And it becomes a very cozy world, and it serves very well. It's regulation by entity, entity-based regulation. Well, along comes DeFi, and what does it do? It disintermediates the intermediaries. It undoes that entity-based regulatory ecosystem that regulators have created, and regulators are struggling to get their heads around it. But the move from entity-based to activities-based regulation is actually a good thing once regulators figure it out. Why is that? Because instead of relying on entities, instead of relying on identification as a first step in every financial transaction, once we go to a token-based model and we don't rely on intermediaries, we now have the opportunity for regulators to become nodes in blockchains. And instead of looking for entity activity, look for activity writ large by using big data analysis and pattern recognition, identify the activity that is problematic, and then get to identifying the entities involved in the primary activity. I'll give you a very simple analogy. When you go to get on the interstate highway, you do not stop at a toll booth and say, my name is Dawn or my name is Arthur, and here's where I live, and here's where I bank. And then they say, okay, go ahead and get on the highway. We now have the information we need if you do something wrong. That's not the way it works. You get on the highway. If you do something wrong, then you get and recognized by pattern recognition, i.e., speeding, weaving through traffic, not stopping at a traffic light. Then you get pulled over, and then we establish your identity. But if you're not doing something wrong, we don't need your identity. And what we need to rethink about financial markets, where we don't have everybody's identity as a first step, we gather identity when people do things wrong. And we now have the tools. This technology provides us the tools to look at patterns of activity to identify wrongdoing. It's an activities-based approach to market regulation as an entity-based. Incidentally, the reason why we have entity-based is because our banknotes, once we went away from a tokenized money system in the late medieval period and the early Renaissance to a banknote system, banknotes require identity in every case. If you want to buy a sandwich with a $10 bill, nobody needs to know who you are, where you bank, or how much money is in your bank. They just need to know whether that $10 bill is a real $10 bill. That's token money. But once we went to account-based money, credit cards, checks, Venmo, Zelle, debit cards, everybody in every transaction to buy a $10 sandwich, we've got to know who you are, where you bank, and how much money is in your bank. And because that's the system of money that we use, that's the system of AML, KYC, regulation that we use. And so it really is challenging for regulators if we go to a digital token, back to a digital token system, to get their heads, or DeFi, to get their heads around not having entities to rely on. But it can be done. It has to be done. We cannot hold back this innovation because we're relying on old type regulatory models that themselves were based upon an old form of money. We can move to digital assets. We can move to digital money. We can move to CBDC. We can move to stable coins. We can move to DeFi if we're willing to move away from entity-based regulation and entity-based market surveillance and go to activities-based market regulation and market surveillance.
That's a great way of looking at some of these regulation challenges and issues in DeFi. So could you elaborate then in this activity versus identity or entity-based regulation, then what challenges do you identify in regulating DeFi? And what kind of things do you think then need to be regulated?
Well, you'd really be disappointed to know how um, uh, behind the times a lot of regulatory enforcement is. When I arrived at the CFTC, most of the cases it took on were originated by newspaper reports about bad behavior that the regulator was reading and then prosecuting cases. I moved us as quickly as I could toward more of big data analysis and pattern recognition. And in a speech I gave at Georgetown Law School, I said regulators must move to a big data analysis part of regulation. I call it, some people call it reg tech. It's about regulators need to be data analytics firms on a par with some of our biggest social media and online retail companies. If regulators could use the rich data sets they have to and use AI and others to do pattern recognition, regulators could actually move to become activity-based regulators and move away from such reliance on intermediaries. So I think the biggest challenge to DeFi innovation is rapidly advancing in the private sector. What's holding it back, I think, is regulators' comfort level with entity-based regulation and their so far lack of vision to go from entity-based regulation to activities-based regulation. But I think as regulators modernize their thinking and get more comfortable with using database tools, they can get there and therefore not be a drag on innovation, but actually be a fellow traveler with DeFi innovation. It would be such a shame if DeFi is throttled for the convenience of regulators, did regulators simply insist upon the old way of doing things and therefore do not, it's not for regulators to dictate innovation, right? That's a mistake. Innovation must innovate to modernize markets, to make markets more efficient, and ultimately to meet the needs of business and society. That's what innovation should do, and regulators should always be struggling to catch up to that. The worst thing that can happen is innovation is suppressed because regulators and government officials like it the way it is. That is not part of the regulator's mission. Regulators are not authorized to say, we like the world the way it is, the status quo must prevail. That is not part of the CFTC's mission. It's not part of the SEC's mission. Our mission is to keep pace with innovation, but allow it to proceed and harness it for good and restrict it from bad.
So I was going to ask, what do you think an ideal DeFi regulation would look like? I guess you just gave some of that answer, but would you like to elaborate?
Well, I think it's got to regulators. The first thing they have to do is become much more adept, and Congress has a role to play. Congress has got to give regulators the financial support to be able to deploy some quality data analytics capability, and that's expensive. It's expensive in terms of people, expensive in terms of tools. But regulators have to do that, and they have to experiment with it, and they have to get good at it, and they have to get more comfortable with it. And once they do, I think they can move away from this insistence on entity. But there's an economic cost to entity-based regulation too, because you're handing out all those monopolies. Regulators have need the support of Congress to build the right tools. They need to get comfortable with the tools, but when they do, they need to deploy them. And as I was saying, there is an economic cost to the entity-based model because it creates a lot of rent-seeking, a lot of monopoly structures within our marketplaces, and I don't think that's necessarily a social cost or an economic cost that's fully measured as well.
So one follow-up question, this activity versus entity-based regulation. So as we know, so even though on Bitcoin and other public blockchain network, even though it's only pseudonymous, but in certain cases, it's still fairly hard actually for the regulator to find and law enforcement to find out, for example, a criminal once
You're
they
right.
discover an illicit activity.
Yeah, but not nearly as hard as it is to get those $100 bills back once they're used for ransom and put in a suitcase, and somebody gets on a flight to the developing world. Those $100 bills disappear immediately. They're never tracked. So you're right. Ransomware using crypto is a problem. But I think law enforcement actually prefers it to the old-fashioned means of using $100 bills or diamonds or other means of paying ransom.
And in this setting, what do you think the U.S. should do to ensure its competitiveness as a global economic power?
Well, I think the first thing the United States needs to do is realize and recognize the full dimensions of what the digital yuan is about. The digital yuan is about a lot more than just digital payments. The digital yuan is about creating the world's first a currency to serve as an operating system for a blockchain-based digital economy that removes a lot of the silos and the latency and the cost of conducting commerce. In our Western system, we have a lot of silos. If you want to trade a share of Microsoft on the stock market, you go to a stockbroker. If you want to put a hedge on oil prices, you go to a futures commission merchant, the CFTC, and there's a separate regulatory structure for each. And if you want to do a commercial loan transaction, you deal with a different intermediary. And if you want to do collateral management across different clearinghouses, you need separate collateral processes. It's a highly inefficient silo-based system with no common denominator. What China views a digital yuan is to serve as kind of the operating system to network all of those different functions. That would reduce tremendous amount of cost. It would reduce a tremendous amount of latency and inefficiency. And if you take all of the cost and inefficiency out of the world's fastest growing economy, you've got an opportunity to send that economy into hyperdrive in a way that I don't think is fully appreciated here in a lot of the West that are thumbing our noses at digital currencies. It's a lot more than stable coins. It's a lot more than the way we're looking at this as digital new payment rails. This is about using currency as an operating system for a fully networked digital economy. And I think the time has come for us here in the United States and elsewhere to recognize that. Now, there's also a lot of shortcomings to what China is proposing. It's certainly, digital yuan is going to be used as part of the social credit system. It's going to be used to reward and punish people for their political views. It's going to be used to surveil social activity and political activity. And that's a real concern. I must say, however, I'm not sure that privacy rights are top of the priority list for people, for central banks in the West that are developing digital currencies. And so, the reason I formed something called the Digital Dollar Foundation, Digital Dollar Project, is to make sure that social norms of a free society are encoded in what I believe will eventually be a digital dollar and a digital euro and a digital pound. I think every major central bank in the world within a decade will be well on their way to rolling out central bank digital currency. And I, for one, want to try to make sure that privacy is the top of the priority list. Privacy, economic liberty, and lack of government censorship over people's economic choices. I think those are some of the most important issues we face as we go from an analog form of money into digital forms of money.
Wonderful. I mean, it's really refreshing to see how, like also many years ago, right, in your cross-border swap regulations, you have looked at international regulations and the international state of the art, in essence. And here now with CBDCs and your new project that you founded, right, the digital dollar, you similar look at what are others doing. Can you maybe give us a bit more insights of what is the digital dollar project? What are its goals and what are the plans that you have?
Yeah, so I believe whenever the United States has done something big technologically, whether that was exploring outer space or exploring the first wave of cyberspace with the creation of the internet, it's always done so as a partnership between the private sector and the public sector. I think it's exemplary to the degree to which Those were not top-down government-directed initiatives, although the government played an important role, but the private sector played a critically important role in both of those major advancements. My worry today is that while money throughout history is as much a social construct as it is a government construct, I don't think society fully recognizes the stake it has in this digital future of money. And so I wrote my book, I created the Digital Dollar Project to kindle in society a recognition of the stakes that are at issue in the future of money. We are too willing, I think, around the world, but especially here in the United States, to give up our privacy in return for the convenience of digital commerce. We're too willing to give up our privacy for the joys of social media and the pleasures of social media. Meanwhile, big tech companies are sucking up all our data and not only using it for commercial purposes, but in many cases, using it to help influence the decisions we make in a way that serves their needs. Well, imagine in a future of digital money, whether it's big tech companies deploying digital money or whether it's governments deploying digital money, are we going to be so at ease to give them our data and allow them to use it to influence the choices we make? I spend a lot of time thinking about liberty and freedom. And in our Constitution, we have guaranteed rights of freedom of religion and freedom of speech. Economic liberty is as critically important as is freedom of religion and freedom of speech. If you do not have, in a capitalist system, your economic activity defines who you are. If you want to contribute to controversial choices, you do that with money. If you want to speak, you do that with money. Money is the lubricant of society, and if we do not have, if the choices we make are surveilled, if the choices we make are censored, if the choices we make are filtered and conditioned, then we do not enjoy liberty for anything. And so I've written my book and I started the Digital Dollar Project to make sure that society realizes the stakes it has in the future of digital money, whether that digital money is provided by Facebook or whether that digital money is provided by the Federal Reserve Bank. The issue, I call it the fight for the future of money. And why do I say that? Because the future of money is going to be decided in a battle that's raging already between democratic governments and dictatorial governments, between large technology companies and Silicon Valley innovators, between the legacy banking system and new fintech entrants. And the missing combatant in that battle is free society. Free society needs to assert its voice in this. And I'm working with a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. We're currently doing a survey of all of this, what you call CBDC, central bank digital currency efforts around the world, to see in all of them where privacy and censorship resistance is as a priority in those efforts. The early results are not good. Privacy is not a big priority for a lot of central banks that are developing digital money. And that's a problem. If we sacrifice our privacy for the sake of the convenience of digital money, we'll have given up something that I think we will regret in the long term. And so that's why I say in my book that money is too important to be left to central bankers. And I borrowed that phrase from French Premier Georges Clemenceau, who after the end of World War I, looking back on the carnage of that war, said war is too important to be left to the generals. In a lot of ways, I hope we don't look back someday and say, it's a shame we left digital money to central bankers or big tech companies because we've lost our economic liberty, because they've taken all our economic data and they're now conditioning our economic choices using that data. And I mean no disrespect to central bankers. I know many of them. I work very closely with them. They have very good intentions. It's just that in a democracy, free people have to assert their voice and make clear what their norms and their expectations are.
And privacy, I mean, we do have technical solutions to achieve the level of privacy, to achieve the freedom. That's even the the important part. So we can get there. So this is certainly an important ingredient, as you would say, for a successful CBDC. Do you think that in the next 5 to 10 years, every country will have a CBDC?
Yes, I think within the next decade, every major economy will have digital currency. It's possible that perhaps even in the United States, that the government lays down priorities and standards, but the currency is developed in the private sector. Certainly, major economic blocs like Europe, the EU, the UK, Sweden are experimenting with central bank digital currency now. We know China is. A lot of smaller central banks, the Bahamas, Cambodia, Laos, are experimenting with this. So there's a lot going on. I think something like 3/5 of the world's central banks are in experiments. And for reasons that I state in my book, I think there are a whole host of attractive reasons why every major central bank is going to go down this road. And maybe for your listeners, I'll take a moment and describe what they are. The first and foremost is data capture. Who owns the data of economic activity? And that's what drove China to ultimately basically step in the shoes of WeChat Pay and Alipay, because it decided that if anybody was going to have that economic data, it would be the central party and not private enterprise. But it's not just in a system like China's. There was the same reaction in the West when Facebook launched Project Libra. The reaction was, whoa, that's way too much information for Facebook to have. Ergo, the central bank, the central government should have a role in all of that data collection. The second reason why I think central banks are attracted to this is because it provides the opportunity to modernize infrastructure. And if you look at what Singapore is doing, what England's doing, they see this as an opportunity to modernize, and especially for economies that are highly dependent on financial services, the opportunity to get an edge on their economic competitors by modernizing their economic and financial infrastructure is a big driver. The third reason is financial inclusion. We've become much more sensitive to the fact that here in the United States, 5% of our population are excluded financially, and as much as 20% are underbanked. But you don't have to just look in the United States. Look at what the Bahamas are doing with their sand dollar, which is an opportunity to actually bring into financial inclusion tens of thousands of their citizens that live on, I think it's 7,000 islands in their archipelago where there are not banking services. But even more broadly, think about a world of 8 billion people I mentioned before, where 1.5 billion do not have identity. And if you do not have identity, you cannot use the legacy system. Why? Because it relies on identity as the first step in every transaction. Without identity, you are under-included. This new innovation would allow for inclusion because it's a token-based system. The fourth reason why I think central banks are irretrievably focused on central bank digital currency or moving in that direction is because it provides a degree of digital precision to monetary policy. We saw that during the COVID crisis when our government, in order to get money into the hands of our most vulnerable citizens, sent them paper checks. Well, what good is a paper check if you're locked at home because of COVID restrictions or you don't have a bank account? And moreover, talk about precision. I think something like 1 million checks were sent to people who were dead. So it's not really a great system when you use an account-based paper system. You don't have the degree of precision that you'd have in a digital system. The fifth reason why I think central banks are attracted to central bank digital currency is the rise and success of stablecoins. Stablecoins are challenging the monopoly over wholesale payments that central banks enjoy, and the monopoly over payments that correspondent banks enjoy, and the fees they earn and the rents that they collect from moving money around the globe. Well, stablecoins are a pretty successful 24/7, 365-day alternative to the 9-to-5 money transmission system. And the sixth reason why I think central banks are attracted to this is because of geopolitical influence. China has long aspired to have a reserve currency status for its yuan. The ability to project and wield economic power that this is going to present is quite remarkable. And I think that that's attractive one to many. I think it's one of the reasons why the EU is moving forward with the digital euro. The seventh reason, it may not be the one that's driving central banks right now, but I think it's the most important of the others, and I hope it becomes a big driver in the future, and that is values. At the end of the day, money conveys values. I think one of the reasons why the dollar has been ascendant for the last several generations is because it carries values of free enterprise, of markets free of government manipulation, of the rule of law, um, uh, uh, of of um, of freedom, of an anonymity to conduct, of economic liberty, I would call it, and free of censorship. The question is, will those be the values of the digital money of the future? Right now, it's not at all clear. As I mentioned, China will use its digital yuan as a means of surveillance. It will use it as a means of social control. Other countries may actually import Chinese-based digital currency technology in order to get those same values of social control into the money they use. Question is the United States going to step up to the values that got us here, values of economic liberty and economic privacy, or will we yield to some of the temptations, a temptation we saw revealed just a month ago when there was a proposal to surveil people's bank account transactions for $600 or more? I mean, there was no better representation of how I think leaders in Washington simply don't get the attractiveness of digital currency with its censorship resistance when they're rolling out a plan to track transactions of $600 or more. I mean, it was almost like nobody's talking to each other here. The reason why everybody's embracing crypto is because of its economic liberty and freedom and censorship resistance. And yet the government's saying we need more information, more information, more information. We want to track you more and more and more. And so values are where the battle is. Again, I talk about the battle for the future of money. The battle lines are drawn, the combatants are clear, and to me, the values that are at stake are as clear as well.
I was actually about to ask what the different approaches to CBDCs are in different countries, but you already perfectly.
Well, it's interesting. Cultures have different approaches to this. I must say, I'm quite disappointed in some of my fellow citizens in the United States. We're more concerned with government surveillance, rightly so, but we're fairly relaxed about big tech surveilling our activities. In Europe, it's the other way around. Europeans have a laudable regulation called GDPR, which is a privacy protection a statute, but it only protects against commercial exploitation of data. It doesn't restrict government efforts, government officials from obtaining commercial data. And so I think we're going to have to, rethink some of these things here in the United States. We need to be as concerned about official collection of data as we are about, and we need to be as concerned about commercial exploitation data, because the future of digital money, it could just as well be a big tech as it is a big government approach to economic surveillance.
So yeah, it's great to hear the reasons that every single country should embrace and deploy their CBDC, and hear your thoughts for the future of CBDC. So now let's also talk a little bit about the future of DeFi more generally. So one, it's interesting. So DeFi is still rather nascent, but however, there's already huge amount of value captures in DeFi. So there's this saying called "too big to fail." For example, some banks, right, are too big to fail, and so on. So do you think for DeFi this also applies? Is it already too big to fail?
Oh, that's fascinating. I think, again, looking at history, societies go through periods of fragmentation and consolidation, and fragmentation and centralization, or concentration, fragmentation, concentration, fragmentation, concentration, and markets do the same thing. When I was on Wall Street in the 2000s, building a marketplace for market makers in the over-the-counter swaps market, there were several dozen participants in that market. The 2008 crisis actually caused many of those participants to fall out. We've got tremendous concentration right now in the financial system, tremendous amount. If you look at the LIBOR market, there's 4 banks that basically are, or in the treasury repo market. You got four banks basically making all the market there. You go market by market by market, and you find a handful of liquidity providers. We've got a tremendous amount of market concentration in the old CeFi environment before we even get to DeFi. And that's a change from 15 years ago when you actually had a great deal more diversity. I'm hopeful that what DeFi could do is actually reduce some of that concentration. I think there's enormous concentration risk in CeFi, and I don't think there's as much concentration risk right now in DeFi. But it's always an expanding and contracting. If DeFi leads us on a path of decentralization for a period, just as the internet led us on a path of decentralization. The internet took us away from centralized retailers like Sears Roebuck and other high street, and for a time decentralized it, but then it's re-centralized again with a handful of FANG companies and online retailers like Amazon. I think you'll see the same thing in financial markets long after I'm gone, long after we're all gone. It goes through periods of centralization or concentration, and then periods of decentralization. And I think right now we can actually benefit from a little bit of deconcentration in the market, because I'm more worried about banks having to almost serve as nationalized industries because they are too big to fail. They do need to be backstopped, but we have less of them. So the few we have are much more critical to the financial system than was the case back when you had a Lehman Brothers and a Bear Stearns and a Drexel Benham and others that are no longer around today.
I guess although with DeFi, also it seems that the internal correlation is quite high with the different like crypto assets, and that's highly correlated, and it has a tendency to lead to, for example, the leverage spiral, and can lead to systemic risks, which may be actually more severe or quite unique to the DeFi setting. Do you think that in the future, when such things happen, will the government step in, just like in 2008, to actually try to stop this downward spiral?
I think the government had to step in 2008 because of the fog of war. I don't think in hindsight, I think now we probably realize it didn't have to step in the way it did. But in the fog of war, it didn't know. As I explained before, we believed at the time that there was $400 billion of swaps written on Lehman Brothers, meaning that if Lehman fell, it would be like a series of grappling hooks pulling down all the other institutions that had written protection on a failure of Lehman Brothers. If there was that much protection written on Lehman Brothers, then there would be other amounts on the other banks. But the fact of the matter is, we now know that the net exposure of Lehman Brothers was less than $9 billion. And so that's a tremendous difference. But we didn't have the tools to take gross amounts and net them down to net amounts, which we do have today. So I think that too big to fail is more of a political solution than it's necessarily an economic necessity. Regulators need to move away from reaction to economic activities based upon headlines and congressional letters and congressional press releases, and move to a market intelligence system. We need to move transactions onto a blockchain basis, put regulators as nodes on those blockchains so they can read the signals as they're happening and can make accurate, precise decisions. And what's the beauty of digital technologies? It allows you to go from the imprecision of analog models to the precision of digital models. And so we need to move to a digital regulatory system where we won't have such fog during wartime. We'll have much more clarity, and more precise decisions can be made. And hopefully those decisions do not result in the government having to step in because a firm's become too big to fail.
To go back a bit on your experiences at CFTC, particularly your personal experiences. So Obama appointed you, right, as you mentioned, while Trump elevated you to the chair. Can you share your personal experiences working successfully under two different administrations?
Yeah, one of the beauties of the CFTC is it's an agency that doesn't get a lot of attention from the White House. It doesn't get a lot of attention from Congress because it mostly oversees wholesale markets, professional markets. It doesn't have an investor protection mandate. It doesn't oversee people's 401ks. And so I must say that both President Obama and President Trump pretty much left us alone. I do tell a story in the book about my one visit, my one interaction with President Trump was entirely unexpected. I actually called over to the White House to simply find out I was scheduled to appear in front of the European Parliament on a matter. I was authorized by my agency to go there and say I was speaking on behalf of the CFTC. I just wanted to know if I could also say I was speaking on behalf of the U.S. government. And so I called to the White House. I said, I'd like to be able to, I'm appearing next week in Brussels. I'd like to say I'm appearing on behalf of the U.S. government. What do I need to do to get that authorized? And the next day I got a call saying the president will meet with you to discuss this. I had never been to the Oval Office. I had never met Donald Trump before. And I was ushered into the Oval Office. And I don't want to spoil the story. I encourage your viewers to buy my book and read about the story of my trip to the Oval Office. I think for those who do not like Donald Trump and those who might like Donald Trump, I think they'll find enough in that story to just vindicate their feelings. It was everything you might expect from Donald Trump and more. Look, people that know me, I'm not a terribly political guy. I mean, I went to Washington not to do politics, but to do policy. And you quickly find out in Washington, you're either good at politics or you're good at policy. I was terrible at politics. I was good at policy. And that's why I went. I'm a markets person. I also call myself an accidental regulator. As I say, I went there to work on swaps policy. I was honored to be asked by President Obama to do it. I think his administration handled the CFTC with great respect and left us alone to focus on markets. But similarly, the Trump administration did the same as well. We just got on with the job. I also, when I went in 2014 under Obama, I said I'll do one term and one term only. When the Trump administration asked me to become chairman, I said, fine, but I'm still here for one term. I'm going to leave at the end of my term. And I did leave at the end of my term in 2019. I let them know that I wasn't looking for another job in Washington. I had done what I'd come to do and I enjoyed it tremendously. It was an honor to serve my country. It was an honor to work with the good men and women of the CFTC, but I'm not a Washington person and I didn't want to hitch up for another. I say in my book, and I really feel it, the problem in Washington is not that people leave too soon. The problem in Washington is people stay too long. And I was determined not to be one of those people who stay too long.
And also from your book, which is freely available, for example, on a Kindle. So we got that your story about that you basically were like Mr. Smith going to Washington, right? So you had kind of this reformist setting or goals when moving there. Can you tell us more about this experience of meeting the CFTC culture and how you've dealt with the resistances, in particular with the Internet of Value?
Washington is, look, every industry is a strange environment until you get to know it, right? Every industry has its own mores and values and ways of doing things. Politics is no different. If anybody is starry-eyed about politics, they needn't be, because politics is just another business. It's just another industry. In a lot of ways, it's a lot like high school, but without some of the adolescent humor that goes with it. It's pretty serious, and there's not a lot of humor in it unless you look for it. And I tried to find some of the humor in it. I tell some humorous stories about my experiences in Washington as an accidental regulator, and I found, I think, a lot of very good, very, very altruistic people that are there to serve the public good. But there's also plenty of people there that are there to do well and do well for themselves. And it's amazing to me how many politicians go to Washington poor, and after 25 years there become very rich, and they do so making $125,000 a year. I don't know how it's done. It certainly didn't work for me, but it's pretty remarkable how that seems to happen in Washington. I did try to reform the agency. I found the agency to be very much focused on the last crisis. It's said that peacetime generals fight the last war, and economists fight the last depression or recession. Well, regulators, peacetime regulators, fight the last market crisis. And the CFTC was very focused on the 2008 crisis, rightfully so. But the last crisis is unlikely to be the next crisis. The next crisis is likely to be something different. And I really felt there were numerous new innovations on the horizon, from DeFi to crypto to illicit commerce using crypto as a vehicle to algorithmic trading on automatic trading. And none of these innovations were addressed by the Dodd-Frank Act. The Dodd-Frank Act is silent about crypto. It's silent about automated trading. And so continually focus on the last crisis and the legislation that came out of the last crisis was not serving us to look ahead to the future. And so it was a big moment for me when I became chairman to say, right, we are now looking ahead. And I created something called Lab CFTC to examine some of the new innovations in the space. I created something called the Market Intelligence Branch, which was a unit of several dozen CFTC employees whose job it was to understand the changing nature of the markets, changing nature of liquidity, changing nature of trading activities, how technology is being used in the markets. And we actually created something called our Chief Market Intelligence Officer, who's a terrific alumni of Goldman Sachs, who is a markets person who understands that and can communicate how markets were changing. And we did a lot of other innovations. We created the agency's first podcast series to explain our mission as a way to communicating things. We created annual conferences on ag economics and financial technology, and a number of other innovations as well, because our goal was to reorient the agency to start anticipating what was coming ahead of us on the highway as opposed to what happened behind us on the highway.
Yes, as we know, it must be quite challenging to be a successful CFTC chairman. And we love to have our students and audience to learn valuable life lessons. So what are the important life lessons that you can share with our students and audience that helped achieve such a success?
Wow, that's a great question. One is believe in yourself, trust yourself, trust your judgment. Number two is be courageous. Don't be afraid. I mean, so much in our life today tells us to be fearful, fear of this, fear of that. That's not what got us where we are. That's not what's, for this country's successes as opposed to its failures, they've been driven by courage. And we need to be a courageous people. We need to be an aspirational people and unafraid to take risks. And to that point, you learn from your failures. Your failures are what you learn from. You don't learn from your successes. So you gotta fail to learn. Celebrate your successes, but learn from your failures. But be unafraid to take risk. And I think that will serve you in every era and every age. And the other thing is, I think we live in a time when we think about collective action, which I think is great, but also human liberty is equally important. It's the dreamers, the people that were unafraid to think outside of the box, that have led most of humankind's greatest innovations. And I think we need to feel as individuals the freedom to think for ourselves, to look at things in different ways, and to explore things in different ways. And if they fail, they fail. You'll learn something from that. And if they succeed, you actually have raised all of us up by your willingness to be creative in your thinking. So my college, I went to a wonderful small college called Skidmore College, and it has a motto that creative thought matters. And I really like that idea, that creative thought by individuals is one of society's most potentially uplifting things you can do. The willingness to think creatively and away from the crowd is one of the best things you can do for society. We look at some of the most successful people, they've been willing to think differently than the group and then lead the group in ways that are good for all of us. And so liberty, courage, willingness to take risks, don't sweat your failures, learn from them, celebrate your success is perhaps some of the advice that I would share with your students.
Great. Thank you. I really love what you said about the creative thoughts are some of the most our valuable contributions that we can make to society. Absolutely. Great. Yeah, thank you. And we've talked a little bit about your new book, Crypto Dad. So could you also share a little bit, how did you decide to write the book? What was your writing process? And what did you want to convey with the book?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So the way I describe the book is it's 1/3 fun stories about an accidental regulator's journey through Washington. A little bit of Mr. Smith goes to Washington. It's 1/3 about our decision to greenlight Bitcoin futures and the resistance and the opposition we faced and the decision to go forward. And it's 1/3 a look into the future a future that I'm certain will be a one of digital money and digital assets. And that's the part where I'm basically saying, not to a crowd within the Washington Beltway, not to academics or scholars, not to fellow regulators, but to ordinary people, to the dentist I visit once a year, to the bookkeeper who lives across the street from me, to ordinary people, to say, money is changing before our eyes. Money is going to go digital in the same way that digitized photography destroyed Kodak, the same way that commerce has gone digital, that transportation has gone digital, and with it, it's uncertain what values are going to be ingrained. Only if free people speak up and make sure that the future of digital money is one of economic liberty, is one of censorship resistance, will it be so. Because there are big vested interests. There are central banks in both democracies and non-democracies. There's big bank, the big banking system. There are regulators. There are big forces at play, and for them, economic privacy and economic liberty is not their priority. It's only going to be their priority if we, a free people, insist it's their priority. And at the end of the day, that's why I wrote my book, to get the message out that we've got a stake in this fight for the future of money.
And yes, we strongly recommend our students and audience to get the book, and it's a wonderful book. Thank you. And also, do you want to share a little bit about the writing process? How long did it take you to write this?
So I did something in Washington that you're not supposed to do, and that is I kept very good notes. And the reason you're not supposed to take good notes is because with all the scandals in Washington, if you've got notes, it can, as I said, I don't do politics very well. I'm better at policy. I wanted to write down the experiences I was having. I wanted to write down my thought process between some of the decisions that I faced. And I also wanted to write down my experience in some of these large government bodies, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, that's a combination of all the major regulators, financial regulators in Washington, the Financial Stability Board, which is a collection of all the G20's major financial regulators. I wanted to take notes of those meetings to reflect on how decisions get made both nationally and globally at the highest levels. And so when I left the agency, I had my notes about my thinking on digital assets, our work to greenlight Bitcoin futures, and the reaction of regulators around the world. And so that was the basis for my writing. And the first thing I did, I took a few months off, and then I went away for a week and actually sat down and organized my notes. And I started putting together the arc of the narrative that I tell in the story, the arc of why I went to Washington, what I saw in Washington, how the Bitcoin rally 1.0 led to Bitcoin futures, my experience with the Senate and gaining the name Crypto Dad, and other work we had done on crypto assets like Ethereum and others. And then ultimately, my formation of the Digital Dollar Project, and why I think that digital money is coming, and why I think there truly is a fight for the future of money, and what values will be encoded, what values will be ingrained in the digital money of the future.
So the good lesson here is keep your notes. Right. Thank you. So there's one question that we ask for all our guests, which is, what are their favorite books that they would recommend to the students and the audience? So of course, Crypto Dad is certainly one of them. So the question here is, besides the Crypto Dad, what are your favorite books that you'd like to recommend to the students and audience?
Well, so nonfiction, I have a number of favorite writers. Neil Ferguson, almost anything written by historian Neil Ferguson is on my reading list. And certainly his history of money was an essential part of my reading. And also Michael Casey, who's written some very good work on crypto, is also on my reading list for nonfiction. On the fiction side, I love Douglas Adams, the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and his work. I like science fiction. I like Ray Bradbury. I also like a number of old romantic writers, going back to Dickens and Mark Twain and others. Sort of it's a broad collection. If you look behind me, I'm actually in my home library, and I'm a big collector of books. Reading is probably reading and music are my two major pastimes. So that's what I like to read.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I was going to say the background looks really nice. It looks amazing. Right. Thank you.
My wife and I have an old Victorian house in northern New Jersey, and it's got some fun space in it. This is an old paneled room that I use as a library and office, and it's a nice place to work.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for such a wonderful fireside chat. Really appreciate it. It's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your amazing experience and insights.
Thank you, Dawn. It's been my pleasure to be with you and be with Arthur. So thank you for this time this afternoon.